I was 32 when I learned that the two people I trusted most had betrayed me. Lisa and I had been married for 7 years, and my best friend Tim was practically family. We'd grown up together, gone to the same college, and worked at the same firm for a time. We'd shared countless memories, laughter, and inside jokes that no one else understood. When I introduced him to Lisa, he embraced her like a sister, or so I thought. It was never in my wildest dreams that this bond could twist into something that would shatter my entire reality. I discovered the affair in the most cliché way possible, by checking her phone. Lisa had been acting distant for a few weeks, but I rationalized it away. Maybe she was stressed, or she needed some space. My suspicions rose one night when she left her phone unguarded on the kitchen counter. It vibrated multiple times, and I glanced at the screen. Tim's name popped up. At first, I just felt mildly curious, but then I read the messages and felt my chest tighten. What had once been innocent friendship had become something more intimate, more brutal in its betrayal. The words were explicit, leaving no room for doubt. She called him babe, and he called her my love. My mind froze. How long had this been going on? I scrolled back, seeing weeks of messages sprinkled with flirtation, confession, and plans to meet at places I thought were ours. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out, but I kept reading. My entire world was collapsing, yet I couldn't look away. Everything I'd believed in, our marriage, our friendship, was a lie. And with every message, my anger and hurt intensified, turning my stomach into unstoppable knots. I confronted Lisa immediately. I didn't wait for an explanation because I already had the evidence. She cried, denying nothing, which felt worse than if she had tried to lie. Tim was nowhere to be found that night, so I drove around yelling into the empty car, rehearsing all the things I wanted to say to him. My rage was beyond anything I'd ever felt. By the time I got home, Lisa was sobbing on our living room couch, phone still in her hand. I couldn't even look at her. Everything was broken, and I didn't know what to do. Tim called me 2 days later, sounding nervous. He stammered through some half-baked apology about how it just happened, and he never meant to hurt me. Hearing his voice made my blood boil. I demanded he meet me in person. He agreed, probably out of guilt or fear. When we faced each other, I saw a broken man, but I felt zero sympathy. His excuses melted together into a pathetic symphony of betrayal. I told him we were done. No friendship could survive this. He hung his head, muttered something about a mistake, and walked away. My heart pounded mercilessly. Lisa tried to talk to me daily. I wouldn't say we talked so much as I watched her beg for a second chance while I stared into the distance. I wanted to scream, but I also felt a numbness creeping in. She claimed she loved me, that she was confused, that Tim had manipulated her. I listened silently, refusing to give her the closure of my rage. After a week of this, I told her to move out. She refused at first, sobbing about how she belonged with me, but I insisted. The betrayal was irreparable, and I wasn't budging. She left to stay with her sister, who lived a few miles away. I was numb, but I started seeing a therapist. I needed someone to talk to who wouldn't judge me or offer platitudes. Week after week, I unloaded my anger, sadness, and confusion, trying to piece together a future from the wreckage. Meanwhile, Tim avoided me at all costs. He stopped coming to mutual gatherings, resigned from our sports league, and acted like I no longer existed. Some part of me craved a confrontation, but he was too much of a coward. That, at least, was completely unsurprising. 2 months later, Lisa requested a meeting. She said she had something important to share, and it couldn't wait. We met at a coffee shop near my workplace. She looked pale, eyes rimmed with circles of exhaustion. I steeled myself for more apologies or pleas. Instead, she told me she was pregnant with Tim's child. My mind reeled. I knew they hadn't been careful, but hearing it said out loud was another twist of the knife. She wanted me to know that Tim had disappeared after learning the news, and she was completely alone. I simply said nothing and left. The next day, she showed up at my place, frantic. She said she had nowhere else to go, that her sister's place was too cramped. She wanted to move back in, at least until she figured things out. I wanted to refuse. My pride screamed at me to slam the door, but a small voice inside reminded me that she was pregnant and truly alone. I told her she could stay for a week, no more. She clung to me, sobbing her thanks, but I felt no warmth. I only felt the heaviness of a responsibility I never asked for. For the first few days, we barely spoke. She slept in the guest room, and I went about my routine in silence. I couldn't forgive her, but I also couldn't throw a pregnant woman onto the streets. One evening, she broke down at the dinner table. She told me Tim had blocked her calls and refused any financial support. She confessed she'd thought about terminating the pregnancy, but couldn't bring herself to do it. As she sobbed, I felt a cold detachment. Her suffering was a direct consequence of their betrayal, and I was in no mood to grant absolution. 2 weeks later, I told her the week was up. She pleaded for more time, tears streaming down her cheeks. I refused, reminding her this was never meant to be a permanent arrangement. She could go back to her sister or find some other solution. I was completely through letting her mistakes invade my space. Before she left, she dropped a bombshell. She said she still loved me. I stared at her incredulous. Love? After everything? I told her love meant loyalty, and she'd proven she had absolutely none. She left with her suitcase, her eyes filled with silent desperation. Over the next few months, I threw myself into work and therapy. I started going to the gym more, trying to vent my anger in healthier ways. Friends asked questions, but I kept the details private. The only person who knew everything was my therapist. Occasionally, I'd see Lisa's social media posts, vague updates about her pregnancy, or requests for help. She never directed them at me, probably out of shame or stubbornness. I found myself scrolling through Tim's accounts too. They were inactive, like he'd vanished. Part of me wanted to find him just to unleash my unrelenting fury, but I had no desire for legal trouble, so I resisted tracking him down. Instead, I served Lisa with divorce papers. There was no hope for our marriage. She didn't fight it, probably knowing her position was weak. The proceedings were straightforward. We had no kids together, no shared mortgage because we were renting. She cried when she signed, but I felt nothing. After the divorce was final, I blocked her on everything, determined to move forward. My life settled into a somber rhythm, yet completely free of her presence, but weighed down by bitterness I couldn't quite shake off. Months passed. I found a strange sense of stability. My sessions with the therapist helped, and I even went on a couple of dates, although nothing serious. Then, out of the blue, Lisa showed up at my workplace. She was visibly pregnant, her belly round, her expression desperate. She asked if we could talk privately. I hesitated, but I didn't want a scene, so I led her to an empty conference room. She told me Tim still hadn't surfaced, she couldn't afford her medical bills, and she had absolutely truly nowhere else to turn. She was pleading for my help. I stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or scream. She wanted help from the man she had betrayed in the cruelest way possible. I asked if she'd considered adoption. She shook her head, saying she couldn't bear to give the baby up. Then I asked about social services, government assistance, anything but me. She lowered her gaze, acknowledging she'd already tried all those avenues. I felt cornered. A bitter sense of satisfaction flickered inside me, seeing her so desperate. But I also remembered how I once loved her, which made the moment feel even more twisted. It felt profoundly surreal. I refused to give her money. Instead, I told her I'd help track down Tim and make him face his responsibilities. She balked, saying she'd tried contacting him to no avail. I explained that we could hire a private investigator if necessary. She looked torn, as though she desperately hoped I'd just hand over cash. I completely refused to be her safety net. If Tim was the father, he needed to step up. She started crying, but I stood firm. I wouldn't fund her life. She left without a clear resolution, leaving me utterly unsettled but resolute in my decision. I wasn't bluffing about hiring a private investigator. Within a week, I'd retained a small firm recommended by a colleague. They found Tim in another city, living under the radar, working odd jobs for cash. When I got the address, I felt a rush of adrenaline. Part of me wanted to confront him physically, but I knew that wasn't wise. Instead, I informed Lisa of his whereabouts. If she wanted child support or accountability, she'd have to initiate it. I even gave her the contact details of a lawyer. This was her problem, not mine. My conscience felt much lighter. Lisa tried to call me multiple times after that, presumably to discuss Tim. I never answered. She left messages saying she was scared he'd dodge financial responsibilities and that she needed my advice. I deleted them all. I was done playing the savior for someone who had destroyed our marriage. If Tim wanted to run, that was between them. My heart still burned with anger, but ignoring her pleas felt like a small taste of revenge. She had chosen him, and now she could face the consequences alone. I had finally firmly drawn a boundary and intended to keep it. Months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Lisa had given birth to a boy. Tim was summoned to court for paternity, confirmed as the father, and ordered to pay child support. He apparently completely vanished again, leaving her in the lurch. Part of me found it satisfying, knowing that their toxic union had collapsed. Another part of me felt a deep tinge of regret that things had ever come to this. Still, I reminded myself that this outcome was entirely of their making. I continued building my life, refusing to be dragged back into their chaos or their pain. As time went on, I started dating seriously again. I met someone new, Jessica. She was thoughtful, understanding, and had an empathy I found refreshing. She knew I was divorced, but I kept the ugly details private for a long while. Eventually, I opened up, sharing the story of Lisa's betrayal. Jessica listened without judgment and told me I deserved slightly better. It felt validating, hearing that from someone who wasn't biased by history. I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was actually hopeful about love. My bitterness didn't evaporate, but it finally loosened its grip. One evening, nearly a year later, Lisa contacted me through a mutual friend's phone. She asked to meet, claiming it was urgent. I debated ignoring her, but curiosity won. We met at a quiet diner. She looked exhausted, like life had worn her down. She spoke about how Tim was completely absent, how she was drowning in bills, and how she realized she had ruined our marriage for nothing. She asked if I could ever forgive her, if we could start over. I stared at her, remembering every knife she'd twisted. My answer was immediate. No, forgiveness wasn't on offer. Her eyes filled with tears, and she tried to hold my hand. I pulled away. She insisted she had changed, that she understood her mistakes. She begged for another chance. But all I felt was a heavy finality. I told her that love cannot survive betrayal, and my self-respect wouldn't allow me to ever re-enter that nightmare. She broke down, sobbing about how incredibly lonely she was, how sorry she felt. I just watched, strangely calm. After everything, I no longer felt the need to yell. I simply shook my head, paid my bill, and walked out without looking back. That was the last time I saw her in person. She tried calling me a few more times, always with the same request for forgiveness or a plea for emotional support. I never responded. I had given her my answer, and I meant it. Meanwhile, Jessica and I grew closer. She eventually moved in with me, and life began to feel normal again, maybe even happy. I learned that betrayal leaves scars, but it doesn't have to define your entire future. I channeled my pain into building something better. In a strange way, Lisa had taught me exactly what I deserved. Just when I thought the chapter had closed, Tim resurfaced. He sent me a long-winded email claiming he was a changed man. He wrote about how he'd hit rock bottom and found religion, and he wanted my forgiveness too. He tried to portray himself as a victim of circumstance, whining about how he'd been aimless and fell into temptation. I stared at the words, feeling a powerful wave of disgust. He had ruined our friendship, betrayed me in the worst way, and completely abandoned his own child. I owed him utterly nothing. I deleted the email without a second thought. That email solidified my stance. Some betrayals are unforgivable. I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I had rebuilt my life without them, and I wasn't about to let their remorse manipulate me. The memory of their betrayal still stung, but it guided my boundaries. I cut off all final threads linking us. No more lurking on their social media, no more mutual friends passing along messages. If either of them wanted to reach me, they'd find only silence. My life was my own again, and I intended to keep it that way. The past would stay in the past forever. Time truly does soften some wounds. 2 years after the divorce, I proposed to Jessica. She said yes, and for the first time in ages, I felt genuine peace. The wedding was small, attended by close friends and family. I didn't invite Lisa or Tim, obviously. That part of my life had been closed off. As I stood there with Jessica, I reflected on how betrayal had nearly broken me, but in a strange twist, it had also shown me my own resilience. Every scar told me I deserved real love, the kind that doesn't shatter at the first temptation. Years later, I sometimes hear rumors. Lisa struggles to raise her son, juggling multiple jobs. Tim owes back child support, occasionally surfaces, then disappears again. Neither of them ever found what they were looking for. I'm not gloating, but I'm not sympathetic either. They chose their path. I chose mine, and I learned that my forgiveness is not a guarantee. Some lines, once crossed, remain deeply forever. Betrayal carries a harsh cost, and they both paid dearly. My life with Jessica is far from perfect, but it's built on honesty and respect. I refuse to let old ghosts haunt us. Looking back, I see how easily it could have utterly destroyed me. The anger, the betrayal, the humiliation of being cheated on by my wife and best friend, it could have turned me bitter forever. But I chose a different path. I chose therapy, self-reflection, and eventually a new relationship that valued loyalty. My revenge was simple, living a life where they no longer had any power over me. I never had to curse their names or stoop to vindictive acts. I just removed them from my life and watched them struggle in the mess they created. That was truly enough. In the end, I realized that real justice sometimes comes from letting people face the consequences of their actions. Neither Lisa nor Tim won in this scenario. Their fling destroyed friendships, shattered trust, and left them to cope with a child they never planned for. Meanwhile, I moved on, stronger in my convictions and clearer about what I would never tolerate again. Their betrayal did not define me, but it did enlighten me. It showed me that I could endure unimaginable hurt and still rebuild. That, more than anything, is what I carry forward. My life is finally my own. So this is my story, the unvarnished truth of how my wife cheated on me with my best friend, got pregnant by him, and then tried to crawl back. There was no forgiveness, only the cold satisfaction of knowing I walked away with my dignity. They sought atonement when their own choices collapsed around them, but I had none to give. In the aftermath, I found the power to shape my destiny without their shadows looming over me. I chose self-respect over reconciliation, and I've never regretted it. This is how I learned that sometimes revenge is simply living well.